Hey, everybody. Welcome back to our second ever episode of Stuff is Contingent with Andy and Matt. Andy Famigletti.
And Matt Brown.
All right. And we're going to talk today about artificial intelligence. I don't think it's going to be the last time we talk about artificial intelligence. I suspect we're going to talk about artificial intelligence again because it's a big thing right now in terms of technology and especially deterministic ways of thinking about technology. Every 10,
Mhm.
20 minutes, we hear that technology is, AI is the future. It's the future, which is just another way of saying you can't argue with it. But we think you can argue with basically everything. So we're gonna talk about that in just a second. But before we do, some fun parasocial conversation times. Matt, what do you got?
I want to hear from you, Andy, about how things are on the farm.
Oh
What uh,
yeah.
what are you still growing? What kind of animal husbandry is happening?
For those of you who don't already know, because you're not longtime fans of a podcast who's only existed for two episodes, my wife and I have a big garden. We have 15, 16 chickens. We have now three hives of bees. So we do have quite a small scale agricultural thing going. It is November here in Southeast Pennsylvania as we're recording this. So most things are winding down. We still have some mustard greens out in the garden. We've got about 4 gallons of honey in the basement. A lot of that will probably go to. I use it to bribe people around the office. If I need the office admin assistant to do me an extra favor, I'll bring her a pint of honey or something like that. Chickens are winding down. Egg production, they still give us some eggs, but between now and like the winter solstice, they really slow down. We've got several dozen winter squash in the basement, sweet potatoes. But yeah, it wasn't a bad year. It was a pretty good year.
Mhm.
You know, climate change makes things weird. There's a lot of weird bugs and funguses that we didn't have to use to deal with. Yeah, you had a good growing season. Are
Okay.
you guys don't have chickens anymore, do you? You used to have chickens
We
one
used
time
to have
ago.
chickens. We never had 15 chickens, but I think we
No.
had seven at our highest, if I remember correctly. When you have that many chickens, do you still name them? Or are they nameless
The
chickens?
hens mostly don't get named. The roosters end up with names, which is a little silly because you kind of have to cull a certain number of roosters. But there's fewer of them. Oh, we've
Mhm.
got new chickens. Did I tell you this?
No.
Did I tell you
What's
about this? Oh, that's right. This was before your Discord server got started. Two of our hens went broody in the
mm,
spring, and so they sat on some eggs. That's what it means. If a hen goes broody, it means it sits on its eggs. And they hatched out four chicks, but one of them disappeared at some point during the summer. Probably a fox or a hawk got it. And so there were three left, but two of them are roosters.
oh no.
So that leaves us with three roosters because we already had the one rooster. And that's at least one too many, probably two too many. So we got to kind of figure out
Hmm.
that. Yeah, so they were real. I'll send you pictures after this. The one we've got one, you're gonna like her. We're calling her Muffin because she's got a big poof on top of
Oh,
her
nice.
head. And I know how much you like a good poofy chicken,
I do like a poofy chicken. That's true.
like
Yeah.
Zazzles.
Like Zazzles.
Matt
Oh man.
famously had a poofy chicken named Zazzles who got lost and then was found. And then I had to reinvent the HTML blink tag
It's true.
to celebrate her
To
returning.
celebrate motherfucking Zazzles. Definitely, by the way, my most successful blog post of all time. The
Oh
trials and
yeah.
tribulations of Zazzles.
Oh yeah. I could see that. I could see that getting
Yeah.
an audience.
We'll put that down in the link in the
Yes.
description.
So
Yeah.
if you want to learn about Zazzles, follow the link in the show notes. All right.
All right,
So
we got important stuff to talk about, Andy, which
artificial intelligence. For this week, we read three really interesting pieces. One, AI as Normal Technology by Arvind Narayan and Sayesh Kapoor, which is kind of a debunking of the idea that artificial intelligence is going to become super intelligent. Instead, they think it's a normal technology that's going to progress a lot like other technologies have. A piece by Mark Watkins, one of my favorite authors about AI and higher education, called Can We Justify College? Kind of Mark really worrying about the impact of AI on entry level information jobs and what that might mean for all of our students. And a piece on this blog, F Stoppers, Photography Specializations Facing Extinction in the Next Decade by Alex Cook, which I thought was a really interesting take on some of the ways that AI might impact kind of everyday photographic jobs like corporate headshots that might not be super romantic, but still pay the bills for a lot of photographers. So, this all paints a somewhat problematic view of the economics of the next decade. Probably it's AI as normal technology that takes the most optimistic view, but their optimistic view is this is just a technology that's disruptive in the way that electricity or the steam engine or the internet was disruptive. It's not God. Like that
Right.
is the argument, and that is like a argument of moderation. It's not God, it's just electricity.
I have a really very, very specific and technical question to ask about that, which is now the time to start the Butlerian Jihad?
I mean, the Pope thinks so. But in all seriousness, this brings up the question of resistance. Whenever these sorts of technological changes happen that disrupt people's lives and mess with how they're kind of thinking about how they're making a living, one response is, I mean, it's the Luddite response, and we've seen that in our current moment with artificial intelligence. People saying what you must do is resist. You mustn't touch this thing. Don't use it. Don't look at it. Don't interact with it in any way. Try to keep your stuff away from all of its platforms. So maybe the first thing then we should discuss is like, yeah, I mean, Butlerian Jihad is a silly thing, but people do talk about it. What do we think of that as a response, right? Like maximal resistance. What do you think, Matt? Like where are you in terms
Yeah,
of
I mean,
resistance?
I'll be honest. I'm tempted by that level of absolute resistance and cynicism. I mean, I feel really sad about this moment with AI. You know, the part of me that we sort of talked about last week, the sort of old school internet nerd, also sci-fi geek, also early adopter, early tech adopter, which I've been a lot of the time. 20 years ago, I would have been like so excited to know that some of these things that AI can do, it can do. It can carry on a conversation. It can do, various other kinds of things. But I'm not excited. I'm angry. I'm bummed out. I'm cynical. And I mean, what happened? How do you feel about it?
I am torn. When our current machine learning systems were still being called machine learning systems before they got rebranded as I was curious about them. I was messing around with them. I installed Stable Diffusion, the image generator. I was messing around with that. I had some initial kind of forays into playing around with text generation just to see what it looked like and what it did. It is very strange to me the way we have altered our perspective about intellectual property and copyright in this moment. Intellectual property and copyright were the least cool things 10 years ago. They were super uncool. All the cool kids pirated stuff. That's what you did because screw those guys who own the information. And now copyright is, and like moral rights in copyright, which are like the most problematic kind, are really kind of being championed as a way of doing AI resistance. So I think the interesting question is, what do you think has changed? Like, let me throw that question back to you. What do you think? What is different? Are we just old? Like, that's not an implausible answer. Are we just old, or is there something different about AI as a part of our technological moment?
That's a great question. I think that part of it is how it's getting rolled out and who is doing the rolling out. The fact that a lot of this is coming from Google, Microsoft, Amazon, etc. The like the sort of two apps that were first thrust on us were one for text generation and one for image generation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Replacing activities that, at least for some of us, are the main non-alienated forms of labor or entertainment that we engage in. I think that's part of it. I don't know that that explains the whole thing, though. I mean, this IP thing is tricky. Imagine I was the kind of person who like had a long history of just pirating images for various uses. Like if I have a PowerPoint presentation for class or conference or for my D&D game, suppose I had no qualms about just Googling, grabbing a image, throwing it in there, no attribution, no attempt to pay anybody for it. That's not fair use. That's not like I'm using somebody's photograph or art to decorate my slides in a way that and if I were the kind of person who did that,
Yeah, perish the thought.
like I would feel totally icky about doing the same thing with Dolly or Midjourney or one of these things. And I'm annoyed when people do it in those contexts. Like when I go to a conference and someone's got obvious AI art
Hmm.
decorating their PowerPoint slides.
Do you see a lot of that? It's actually, I haven't been to that many conferences lately, to be honest.
I don't know. It's not like super common, but like I feel like every time I go to a big philosophy conference in the last couple of years, there's like at least one guy. It's always a guy, but there's at least one guy who's doing that, and it just seems gross. Yeah, I've seen people who are like showing off their like picture of their D&D character, and it's like a Dolly pic. It's an obvious Dolly picture or
That was
something.
the one. I did a series of focus groups with students about a year ago now, where we were talking about AI, and they had a mix of opinions about it, but the handful of creative uses that I heard were mostly from tabletop role players who were using them as like a way to just flesh out a campaign setting that they were doing. They wanted to visualize something for their players.
Yeah, I have a friend. Yeah, I have a friend who does it all the time. He like character profiles and setting stuff. Like he makes those images and he throws it up on whatever Roll20 or whatever it is they use. But it bothers me. It bothers me in a way that like just grabbing an image off a Google image search and throwing it in doesn't bother me. Is
Here's
that
the
like
thing.
totally inconsistent? Is that like am
Here's the
I
thing. So I haven't been using all that many borrowed images in my slide decks for a few months now. But when I think back to when I used to do that, which I used to do all the time, I feel like most of the time there was some kind of element of transformative use. When I'm talking to my students, I'm almost always talking about like, rhetoric. And so it's not like there's a picture of rhetoric out there that I can just pull, but I would grab, a meme picture or something else that was either supposed to have some witty sideways connection to what I was talking about, or there was some running gag I'd set up at the beginning of the semester that I just kept coming back to. And so there was some transformative thing. I'm not saying it was like a genius transformative thing, but it was like I was like, okay, I'm going to do this with it. Would you say that was like when you were, I mean, if you were borrowing images for a slide deck, was there also some sort of like, okay, wasn't quite
I
just
don't
straight up borrow?
I don't, I mean, a lot of the time I don't think so. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, it's like I'm talking about a historical figure, I'm just grabbing somebody's picture of that historical figure. I'm talking about science labs, I have some picture of somebody working in a science lab from their website or whatever.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think, or just like decoration, like let's just put a in Rothko on this slide in front behind my title.
I guess though, even with something like that though, okay, so you're illustrating something, you're
Yeah.
making some kind of thematic connection. There's some kind of input from you. And I almost wonder if what makes AI so creepy is that it's really designed to, in some ways, limit that input or limit that like transformative work, maybe, at least in its default method. Because you just tell it what you want and it just gives it to you because that's what it's programmed
Right.
to do. Just give
Right.
me whatever I want as long as it doesn't trigger some kind of safety guardrail, which who knows if those are even there anymore because now there's a Nazi one, so that's great. I'm sure that has different guardrails, which are awful. Is there a difference between a person making that connection and the connection being made for them? Does it collapse that distance too far? Is that what's going wrong?
It's true that, when you're borrowing images from an internet search, you do have to get a little creative sometimes about like what's going to fit because like the thing you want doesn't exist pretty much
Right.
ever, right? And so you have to make decisions. I guess you don't have to make decisions like that if it's just giving you exactly what you want. I don't like that. I mean, there's like a whole other conversation we should have about the value of like doing work on your own versus like just having it handed to you. But it's I don't think that's what makes it feel gross. I think, I mean, I'm inclined to think that these image generative models produce images based on having scraped millions of images off the internet is part of what makes it gross, which is what makes me worry also about whether I'm being coherent and consistent
Mm.
because I obviously don't have a problem with me scraping one image off of the internet to do the thing. So why am I worried about Dolly scraping millions of images off the internet to do their thing?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that comes down to, in some ways, like there are questions of power there.
Yeah. Okay.
Like,
Yeah.
and I think that's one of the things that AI as normal technology as an essay kind of dances around and talks about some. And I think their answer to that. So let me take a step back and kind of unpack what I'm saying here a little bit. So I think what you're saying is like, yeah, there's something weird about why is this mass scraping feel terrible when other kinds of intellectual property borrowing and remixing, which is effectively what generative AI doesn't actually generate things, it remixes them, right? It remixes them at scale very, very quickly. And it's striking to what extent that is true and to what extent the term generative AI, I'm making air quotes here for people listening in a purely audio form, generative AI, I think tends to conceal that or tries to conceal that in ways that the creators of the tool, I think the creators of the tool are not always really aware of what's happening. They're always very big on, especially with like image generators, oh, we're going to give this tool a prompt that's so weird that it can't possibly just be something memorized that the algorithm has memorized. It's never seen this exact image before, and look, it generated it. Like for a long time, Stable Diffusion had like an astronaut riding a horse on Mars as like the prompt they would use as their like demo for everything. And okay, yeah, there's not that many pictures of an astronaut riding a horse on Mars. It's true. But if you look at the pieces that the algorithm has put back together, they're all fairly familiar. The astronaut looks like a NASA picture of an astronaut, and the horse is a horse, of course. And you know, Mars looks the general tone of Mars generally looks either like kind of like a science fiction movie or kind of like something from JPL, and there's a kind of a remix happening, taking these elements and it's mashing them together. And in my, you know, I haven't played with an image generator in a while, but in my experience, if you asked for that in a very kind of stable way, you would get something coherent. And the more kind of abstract you got, the weirder the output got, right? It really didn't like that. It wanted known things it could lock onto and then remix. So it's doing remix, is my point.
Mm-hmm.
So why does this remix feel weird? Well, because when we were all really hot on remix 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago now, in many cases, it was a subcultural thing. It was kids on the internet making videos and borrowing music and movies from big powerful corporations and mashing them up to say something new, to transform them in some way. Which I mean, the algorithm is, to its credit, transforming its source material. It does that too, but it's doing it at scale and it's doing it on behalf of hugely powerful corporations very nakedly. And it's actually true that the kids remixing 15 years ago were also kind of working without really knowing it on behalf of an insurgent set of corporations that are now the dominant ones. Like when folks were remixing stuff 20 years ago, they were making content for Google and for YouTube, which then became part of Google, and for social media platforms, which are now these things that stand astride the world. And those insurgent companies needed that remix because it gave them content that was not directly owned by their competitors. Warner Brothers wanted to own the internet. Like that was their whole plan, right? They were going to become, what were they? Like, right? Time Warner. Time Warner. They were going to own the backbone. They were going to own the internet. You know, you were going to go to your portal and just get what the cable company wanted you to have on the internet. And that was going to be the internet. And the reason we didn't get that in many regards is because various different kinds of remixers and other folks made other stuff and people interacted with that. And they interacted with that through Google and through social media platforms. And if you now call up the list of the biggest internet sites in the world by traffic, it's Google and the social media platforms. And now, in the last 2 years, OpenAI, right? ChatGPT is the fourth most visited website in the world. Mm-hmm. Like I only looked that up probably 8 months ago, and I was like, oh,
right,
okay,
that's wild. That's wild.
So
well, I think
and
part of what you're pointing to, Andy, is that I think, okay, if I grab a picture and put it in my PowerPoint, I'm not putting anybody out of work. I mean, it's like I wasn't going to pay somebody to make my PowerPoints look prettier. I was just going to have more boring PowerPoints.
I mean, you and me weren't. No professor has ever had
Right.
a staff to put their PowerPoints together, but somebody does.
That's true. That's true. Well,
Like there are
that's
guys in
true. Yeah.
corporate, there are people in corporate who are like they've got an art
Right.
department.
But there's a feeling, and one of the articles that we read sort of suggests this, that things like DALL-E are going to put whole categories of artists out of
Yeah, F
work.
Stoppers was very much suggesting that. And in those very like a corporation needs headshots for their website. That there was no way to borrow those, so they needed them. They needed to own them. Instead of having that, they can just have their employees take a selfie on a smartphone and send it to something like Dali, and it will clean it up and it will make it what they need. And in the same way, yeah, like and that's what's interesting, right? Because you and me would borrow things to put on a PowerPoint, but people who were in more powerful positions, if they had any kind of public exposure, might not have because, well, they didn't own those things. And there might be some real liability there. And what's interesting is that there's no ownership attached to these generative AI outputs. They're just, well, you can just use them, is the understanding, at least until the full set of lawsuits goes through the courts. Yeah, I mean, copyright law becomes a real mess as we think about these things. But I do think, yeah, part of what's happened is like the former corporate insurgents have become dominant players, and that changes our political sense of the remix that's happening because it's not people on the edges who are kind of like making an alliance with these insurgent power corporations. It's the corporations who are front and center saying, here is your new tool for creating content. You must use it. And that feels very different.
Legally speaking, an AI is not a person, and so can't create copyrighted
Yeah, and I
content.
mean that is what the
Right?
Copyright Office is now saying, that you cannot copyright any output, like anything you make with a generative AI is non-copyrightable, which is, I think it's interesting to come back to photography and photography as an art form, because from the point of view of a painter, photography is already completely automated. Like all a photographer does is press a button, like a monkey can do it, like literally a monkey did do it. And yet, if you take a photograph in a thoughtful way, like you even try to take a photograph in a thoughtful way, there is a creative process there where you're like, okay,
Yeah.
I'm framing my picture, I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about that. And so I guess what's interesting to me is the question of, is AI as a creative technology normal in that sense too? Where right now we're like, this thing is just totally automated and that's gross. And, like where's the creative input there? And will people in some way figure that out? Will there be some kind of more creative approach to using AI systems that generate images and text than what we're currently seeing, which is mostly not very creative? And part of that may be because I don't think, like, I had some ideas for creative things to do with AI like a year ago. I'm like, oh, that could be creative. Maybe I'll do that. And I am not touching any of those because I don't want to get yelled at. Like I don't
Yeah.
think it would go over real well. Like my sense of things is that the people who are
Yeah.
interested in creativity and the people who are interested in AI, they don't want to talk to each other. And if you have an idea of like, well, maybe I could do this with AI that would be creative, like I've had those ideas. I'm like, nope, not today. We'll wait and see if situations change because no, it's just not going to go over.
Yeah. As a practical matter, while the stink is on AI with vis-a-vis the art world, yeah, I think you're probably
Yeah,
right. I definitely think it's conceivable that artists could do clever things with AI systems that would count as art. I don't think it's conceivable that there would be a kind of like normal practice of creativity with AI in the with these kinds of AI systems that we're seeing today. I mean, in the broad sense, maybe, but with LLMs and image generators, I don't think there would be a normal practice like there is with photography. of art. But I do imagine there would be an abnormal practice of, fing with the system to make it do weird shit, which is a very storied genre of art in all media, right?
All right. So unpack that for me. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so just to give another example so it's clear to everybody what I'm talking about. You can go to a concert and hear a flautist play the flute and produce beautiful music. When you go to like a really experimental flute concert, you are gonna hear somebody doing super strange things to their flute, like talking through it, the whole, like doing weird breathy things that don't produce tones, which if you go to anything at a university school of music, you're gonna likely see something like that. And so that's like normal versus abnormal, right? Experts in these areas of art probably have better terminology than that. Um, I I don't think that you're going to get like prompt engineer creative types who just become really good at producing good AI art through something like GPT or Dolly. And it's because, in my view, what you get is not creative remixing, but like calculated mediocrity out of these systems. You get a kind of like a slightly stochastic center mean of all past work. What you don't get is virtuosity, and what you don't get is interestingness. That's what I see when I see students, using AI to write stuff for them, as you get the most mediocre kind of milk toast versions of a grammatically correct and superficially accurate answer to the prompt. But you don't get anything with any like life in it.
I think one of the things that might bring us closer to some of our readings again is just think about to what extent that is a result of design choices in the way AI systems have been deployed and not necessarily inherent features of language or image models themselves. A image model, at least the last time I played with one at any kind of depth, which was probably a year ago, and I should probably get back to this. But an image model has something called a guidance scale, which is a number that you give it that tells it how faithful to the prompt you've given it you want it to be. Like how much do you want it to steer towards the prompt, and how much do you kind of want it just to wander around? And by default, that guidance scale is set up pretty high so that if you ask it for a horse, it gives you a horse. I'll link a blog post of mine from back in 2022 in the show notes. I did a thing where I called it the phase space of stable diffusion. I took a stable diffusion prompt and I ran it across like many different guidance scales and different inference steps and kind of saw what it popped out for all of them. And it's interesting. At these different guidance scales, it gives you different results. LLMs have something similar. It's called a temperature setting. So, on its own, a large language model ought to be deterministic. It ought to answer the same prompt the same way every time because it's guessing most likely next word based on the words it already has. That's how it works. Like it ought to just guess the same set of words. But to make that not happen and make it all feel a little more natural, it has a temperature setting that injects a certain amount of randomness into its choices. So it doesn't always choose, it's like if you typed with autocorrect, but you didn't always choose the middle word. Sometimes you chose the one on the left or the right, you'd end up with a different result. And it kind of does that. And it's more sophisticated than that, but it's kind of the same thing in principle.
Right.
So I think this comes back to some of the things that our authors were talking about because they were all really interested in how the design choices made when these systems are deployed influence. I mean, Narayan and Kapoor were interested in this. Like, there are different design choices that people are making. And one of the things I think they were big into was, well, if we're just scared of AI as a dangerous god, then we want to limit who can get it. The analogy to nuclear weapons is used. Right? Like, oh, if this thing is as dangerous as a nuke, then we want non-proliferation. We want hardly anybody to have access to it. But they're like, well, it's not quite really like that. If it's not like a nuke, then in fact, non-proliferation, only letting a few people have it, is centralization of power. And what they think we ought to do is not that. Is to decentralize who has access to it so that you might have different people making different design decisions about what an AI system looks like. And they might not all look like ChatGPT. They might not all give you the same studied mediocrity that ChatGPT gives you, which I suspect it gives you precisely because I suspect one of the main things it's being used for right now is higher education plagiarism. And so you want it to sound like a very careful, measured like output. That's a very different response to the technology than Butlerian Jihad. Instead of like, let's burn it down, like, what if we distribute it? What if we let lots of people play with it? Maybe somebody will come up with something that does not have the dismal design choices that are baked into the mainstream tools. And I guess like
Yeah.
what do you think about that? I'm not sure what I think about that. I'm curious to know like what's your response to it?
Yeah. I want to push back a little bit, right? So with ChatGPT, there are two things that contribute, in my mind, to the mediocrity of the output. I mean, I think you're right. One is design decisions that sort of bridge the gap from user interface to the underlying model, the LLM model, GPT 5 point whatever. But I also think the underlying tech is part of the issue here because large language models, I mean, all of these systems, right, are big pattern matching machines. The whole thing is they take an enormous quantity of data and they sift out and learn patterns. And for this class of them, they, set up a system that can generate things within the patterns. So in the case of the large language models, it is next text, next word prediction. And next word prediction is based on a statistical account of what belongs after this word in the absolute middle, the absolute statistical top of the bell curve, right? And you're right that you can get deviations from that with adding more stochasticity to the model outputs, but I don't think stochasticity is creativity. And I don't think stochasticity can produce
Mm.
virtuosity. And I think those are the two things that you need for normal art. So the critique of Narayanan and Kapoor of these super intelligent AI apocalyptic scenarios by me is well taken, right? But I think there's another kind of apocalyptic scenario that no one is really talking about, which is that these systems are not going to become super intelligent, but the sort of dark alternative to that, which is that they become super idiotic in a way that we know people are super attracted to. There's a certain kind of super idiotic that Americans love and, in fact, have elected to our highest office in the land. What I mean by that is the system actually knows nothing, can really do nothing, but it convinces so many people that it is amazing and powerful and brilliant because it produces lifelike text and it hacks our brain, which is like built to respond to narrative and conversation. And so you have all of this sort of, I mean, the phenomenon that's called AI psychosis, but also just, I think, this enormous amount of attribution error where people are thinking that AI is doing something really brilliant when in fact it's doing something really idiotic, but it's basically hacking their brains to make the wrong evaluation of it because it's dressing it up. We're talking about ChatGPT and similar large language model interfaces. It's dressing it up in words, and we're starstruck by
We
words.
are. I mean, now we're getting into the thing that I think, and this is going to have to wait for another episode. We're going to think of a better way in to talk about it. I think the fundamental thing that makes us so unnerved by large language models is, in fact, that we are deeply unnerved by language. Like that, it's language that scared us first. If you go back and you look at Phaedrus, whether that's Plato's or Socrates's, I can never figure out. Right. But if you go back and look at Phaedrus and you look at what's being said in Phaedrus about writing, which tends to get brought up in the discussion of large language models and AI pretty frequently, because in that, Socrates is like, this thing writing, it's an illusion of knowledge. It's going to make people think that they're smart and remembering things, but they're really going to be dumb and forgetting everything because they're going to have given, the text is going to be doing it for them. They're not going to have real knowledge. But the thing that always struck me is that in that same piece, Socrates, as he always does, is on a mission to destroy rhetoric because that is his first goal, is to destroy rhetoric as a philosopher, right? Like rhetoric must be destroyed. So it's actually kind of interesting that here we are, a rhetorician and a philosopher. Like here we are kind of having a conversation. And so like he's like, I must destroy rhetoric. One of the things he's talking about is like how deceptive language is and how you really only can get around that, he says, if you've kind of like had this, this like mystical experience basically that only philosophers have, where they can see the truth and the rest of us are just these muddled things. That's gonna have to wait for another show to dig all the way into, but I think it's interesting that you're saying that we're taken in by words because it touches on that. But then what's interesting to me is that when you were talking just now, the way you were forming your sentences, ChatGPT was the subject of the sentences. You were giving it a lot of agency. And so I think my question then is, are we sure it's ChatGPT doing that? The other analogy that always comes up in discussions of language technology, going all the way back to Phaedrus, what does he call writing in there? He calls it a pharmacon, right? The drug that's also a poison, right? We're always talking about it in terms of drugs. This is something that people did back at the dawn of computing. This comes up in like Levy's Hackers and a bunch of other early accounts of computer technology. Fred Turner in his Cyberculture to Counterculture talks about a bunch of these. But folks talking about like, yeah, I went to go and use a computer and it was like being on drugs. Like I didn't know where the time went. I was just typing stuff into things. I was playing Space War, and the next thing I knew, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. It was like I'd just come off a bender, like I didn't know where I was. So we're always talking about drugs, and I think it's interesting that oftentimes we give drugs a lot of agency when people get addicted and terrible things happen to them because they've struggled with addiction. And we say, oh, this drug or that drug did all this harm to this person. But there have been at least some experiments with animal models that suggest that if you just give rats access to cocaine and or some other drug, I don't remember exactly what it was. If you could just give them access to this drug and they have like a healthy little rat community, they mostly just ignore it. Like they don't interact with it all that much.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Rat Park. Rat
right.
Park is great.
But if you like stress the rats out and you put them in these little boxes and you don't let them have their little rat friends, and then you give them access to the cocaine, they go crazy. They're just like, oh yeah, let's just do it. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, is ChatGPT doing all these things? Or do we have a fundamentally broken society? And here's ChatGPT stepping into those gaps in really problematic ways. I think some of that
Yeah.
gets a little overblown. Like some of these cases of self harm are terribly tragic, unbelievably tragic what has happened to these kids and other people who have been using ChatGPT and have ended up harming themselves. But correlation does not necessarily imply causation there.
No.
So it just gets very,
Yeah.
yeah. And so I wonder about like to what extent do we when we criticize these things, do we give them too much agency in our criticism? Are there other ways that we could imagine our society and our technology where we might be able to engage with a tool like this in ways that aren't so harmful?
Yeah.
And I
I think that's a great question, Andy. And I do think that vulnerability, like a certain kind of social vulnerability, is a part of the equation. Yeah, I think the more sociological work on drug addiction does show that. And certainly people who these really bad things are happening to them with their interaction with ChatGPT, whether it's, people who tragically harm themselves, or you may remember a story recently about someone who got convinced by ChatGPT that he was a math genius, even though he,
yeah.
yeah, had a high school education or something. Like there's a whole background, right, of like why that person was vulnerable to that. On the other side of things, though, I mean, I have had conversations with researchers who are convinced that their like super expert use of ChatGPT in doing their scholarship, it makes them like way more effective, and its ability to synthesize information and check their work and check their arguments is fantastic. And they're, well-adjusted and well-accomplished people who are just, I think, attributing to ChatGPT work that they are doing themselves. And you like get them to like explain their process and their interactions. It's just like they're actually doing all the work. David Bowie used these oblique strategy cards in some of his
I
song
love those
composing.
things.
Oblique strategies.
Yes.
They're just they're just these cards with these really like gnomic little phrases on
Mark
them, right?
Sample wrote a really
That
cool
are meant
piece
to,
about those years ago that I read, and I really enjoyed it, and I think about them all the time. Yeah.
yeah, they're super fun, right? And they're just like little bits of language that are meant to pop things loose in your brain and spark some ideas. And I think that there's something similar going on with large language models, or the chatbots built on large language models, is that they can be productive or harmful, but only in this kind of like Rorschach test, you're getting out of them what you're putting into them way. But the illusion that it is contributing something is so much more compelling because of the way it produces language that feels natural, I think.
Yeah, I think there's probably some truth to that. I have had a couple of interactions with these tools where it was able to like, it ends up functioning like a kind of search engine, like is where we are with these things now, where it's like I don't know exactly how to describe what I'm looking for to a search engine, but I was able to describe it to this thing. I have to pull up the example of that I had. I was actually looking for, of all things, a William Morris text with someone else I thought we might get around to talking to tonight. Maybe we'll talk about him another night. And when I straight up asked it, like, where did this quote come from? It wasn't able to tell me. But then when I asked it, like I had the source. I was getting this William Morris quote from a piece that a DH scholar, Bethany Avowski, wrote years ago, and she, for whatever reason, didn't have a formal citation to this one source. She must have just overlooked it. Like she had sites for everything else. But she did describe like where she had gotten it from. She was like, it was from this book that was written by his nephew, I think, about the press that they worked on. And then for whatever reason, she didn't go on to like put a formal site into the doc. So I'm like, okay, ChatGPT, what was the book that William Morris's nephew wrote about their press? And I was like, oh, it's this. And I took that title and I put it into the Internet Archive and I pulled up the book and there's the quote. And I wasn't able to find it any other way. So it does make oblique connections sometimes because it does have all that data kicking around back there. And yeah, I do think that gets overblown,
Yeah, I mean,
right? But I
yeah,
think
look,
it does that is an interesting capability that comes out of that.
yeah. I mean, if what you're, yeah, look, I mean, again, it's a pattern matching engine. It's a statistical association engine. That's what this style of machine
Right.
learning does. So if you're looking for like, if you're looking for associations between bits of language, it can do great stuff. If you're looking for like true information or all kinds of other things that people try to use
Mm,
it for, if it can be successful insofar as that is closely related to this sort of patterns and associations game that it is actually trained to
I think
play.
what we've arrived at is a much larger conversation about novelty and both creativity and knowledge production. And that comes kind of goes full circle back to that question of remix. Because one of the big criticisms of remix 15, 20 years ago was, well, there's nothing novel here, right? People are just reusing stuff they've already seen. And there were novel elements about remix. And then of course there were some not so novel elements. And I think that, what's interesting to me is that there is this very modern capital M in the like grand eras of thought sense, this very modern privileging of the novel. Things have to be new, like really new to be creative. And there's a way in which that is, I think, an artifact of recording technology of the sort we're all very familiar with, like mechanical reproduction of signs. Because once you have that, then just reproducing a folk story is no longer that interesting because, well, you've already got that. And so you've got to make something new. And so the new becomes this like really privileged thing. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of vernacular creativity that doesn't really do that. People play in cover bands. They play in cover bands all the time. They love it. They don't do anything new. They're just playing the same songs. And sometimes they're trying to play them exactly the way that, this person or that person played them. And I'm not here to like give like a full-throated defense of that. I think there can be something really problematic about like the like celebrity worship that happens there and that like desire to reproduce. And I'm a snotty academic. I love novel stuff. Like, oh, this is new. Well, nobody's ever seen this before. Cool. That's what I'm constantly trying to do with photographs. I'm always taking these like photographs where I'm trying to be like, what's the way to do this that won't look like every other picture? And mostly what I get is a bunch of stuff nobody wants to look at because it's just like, why did you take 17 pictures of that rock, Andy? Like, no one cares. Take a picture of this beautiful building like that everyone, well, there's a million of those already. So this way in which vernacular creativity is reproductive, I think is one of the things that's weird about ChatGPT because it reproduces in this much more flexible way that starts to short circuit some of even that. And yeah, and like to what extent is the creative impulse in its broadest sense not necessarily about making anything new. It's just about the joy of making something at all. And
Yeah.
like maybe that persists even in an LLM world because people still play in cover bands, even though you could just listen to that recorded music if you want to. They just like redoing it. But of course, they don't make any money playing in those cover bands. They've got to work a day job and then play in Scrantonicity on the side. And that brings us back to these larger economic questions of like who gets paid and for what. All right, should we try to wrap up? Have some kind of like
Yeah.
final thoughts section?
Yeah, we probably should.
So Matt, what do you think? What do you think what's your takeaway from all this? What's your kind of final thought about this conversation about AI and creativity and intellectual labor?
I think I came into this I came into this conversation a cynic, and I think I'm still feeling very cynical, but it certainly is complicated in a lot of ways. I think that we've raised some interesting issues about how we think about language, art, creativity, novelty, virtuosity, and the theme that I think you've brought up forcefully in our conversation that I think is the most important one to emphasize in a lot of these conversations is power, particularly economic power, and how that sets sort of the context for a lot of what we're talking about. A lot of our evaluation of this as a technology has got to come down to how is it interacting with existing sort of hierarchies of economic power and relations of economic exploitation, and how is it changing or perhaps distorting or worsening such relationships.
Yeah. No, I agree
Yeah.
with you completely there. That question of power is the question. And I think the thing that makes AI feel so troubling and dangerous and icky right now is the way in which it's being deployed by and on behalf of very powerful interests and designed in a way that reflects their perspective, their desires about how the world should run, not just in the ways that we would usually think about the ideological. It's not just, Elon Musk can go in and make Grok basically parrot white supremacy, which he has done and is doing. It's not just that. It's also, I think, a more mundane ideological, or not even ideological, a more mundane just point of view thing where I feel like AI systems as deployed were designed by managers on behalf of managers, and their way of imagining the world is a managerial one. The way you do things is you give instructions, and then something somewhere goes and does the thing. And then you, in your genius way, give another set of instructions. I mean, that certainly is a way of getting things done, but man, I hate that. And I think a lot of people hate that. Like
Right.
they want William Morris, who I've been reading a lot of, said there's no art without resistance in the material. That was the quote that really turned me on to him that I read in that piece by Bethany Navowski years ago, and it just stuck with me. I had forgotten most of the rest of that piece, which was a lovely piece when I went back and looked it all back up. But man, that one quote from Morris just like seared itself onto my brain for a decade, even though I knew nothing else about the guy. But that idea of like, yeah, what we do as creators is we don't like give instructions, let things happen. It's about the doing of like resistance in the material, and that can take a lot of different forms. Photography has it, writing has it, computer programming can have it. And so that question of like, what is
Yeah.
resistance in the material and what does it mean to be creative is interesting because yeah, I think that's missing from the way they're being deployed. And the other then question is like, how do we keep creativity and the bare essentials of human existence together? And that's also very much a question of power. And it always has been. Like it always has been. And certainly, like our old recording technologies already had certain power relationships baked into them that upset some of those things and meant that some people with some creative skills were not able to use those economically anymore in those moments either. I guess what is interesting to me about creativity is that unlike many other things that people work on really hard, it is fundamentally overabundant, right? Like you can't run out of it. Like there is an argument to be made for more efficient ways of producing food. Like even though I find all of the hand labor that me and my wife do to make food around our little house farm like very satisfying and I enjoy them, like I am under no illusions. Like if it was up to us to feed ourselves, we would be in real trouble, especially if there was any kind of bad season. Like if there was a bad season, like our kid would die. Like that's what happened to people for like hundreds of thousands of years. Like they worked very hard to grow food. I'm sure they thought it was satisfying as hell. And then there would be a bad season and their kids would die. And that's what would happen because there would be a famine because we would run out because there was scarcity. There has never been a famine of song ever. Like that's never happened. People have always like if you've got people, you've got poems. Like it's just gonna happen unless they starve, unless they literally starve, which can happen.
Right.
But it's not that you run out of poems, you run out of food. And so there's like this way in which the logic of scarcity, which is the logic that is built into AI systems, like we are going to make language better by making more of it cheaper. But we've always had too much of it. We've had too much of it from the beginning. And then recording made it worse.
Right.
And so, like, why is that the
Right.
logic that's being built into these systems? Well, because it's being developed under like a industrial capitalist logic that efficiency is always better, so that's what you do. But could there be another logic?
Right.
I'm not sure. Like, I feel like you came into this cynical and you stayed cynical, and that's fair. I think being cynical right now is a fair place to be. But I've talked myself into kind of like, well, maybe things are contingent. Maybe a better world is possible. I don't know. We'll see if I made
the thing that's scarce is not art, it's not language, it's money to pay people to do that stuff for a living. When I mean that's what they're really talking about is making people redundant.
Oh no, I agree completely. But that's like to the extent that like the logic of efficiency with food, like even if you're unemploying some people who would otherwise be happy little gardeners, it still makes some sense because you're going to make a lot more food and people aren't going to starve. Good. But the logic of efficiency with culture doesn't hold that way. Like if you're making it so fewer people can get work as poets, it's just a loss because you're not, even if you get way more poetry, like who cares? Efficiency, power, creativity, technology. They're big things. And we're going to talk about them more on the next episode.
Yeah, I feel like we could do 3 more.
Oh yeah, we're definitely going to come back
with
to
the
AI.
material.
Yeah, oh yeah, AI is definitely not going away. But like, we're going to think of some other things to read and talk about, and probably we should think of those and then come back and edit those in. Hey everybody, so that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm telling you what's in the next episode. Next episode is going to be me and Matt talking about education and AI. We're going to be looking at some publications. We're going to look at Mark Watkins again because we hardly got to talk about him this time. And we're going to look at a few other folks who are interested in the intersection of higher ed, plagiarism, AI, what we should do about AI in the classroom. That's what we're going to be talking about on the next episode. Be sure to tune into that, and we'll see you then.